Hello and welcome to Ravlic at Large. My name's Tom Ravlic, and this is series 2 of this particular interview series. It's being streamed to YouTube and LinkedIn. Thank you for joining me for the new year 2025. The pilot season has been welcomed by a range of you that have viewed different interviews. Your feedback's been taken on board. Thank you for that, and keep providing it through the various platforms, whether it's X, LinkedIn, YouTube, however you want to contact me, I'm happy to listen. One of the biggest issues that a certain group of people in our community faces, even today, is the ability to feel welcomed and work at ease in workplaces. I'm, of course, talking about the area of disability and accessibility for people in organisations, whether they're public sector, not-for-profit, private sector, it does not matter. There are still difficulties for people with disabilities. Now, to explore this issue is someone who's got both lived experience and professional experience in dealing with how you handle corporate culture and how an entity like an accounting firm, for example, deals with issues of disability and inclusion. Dani Fraillon is a partner at Deloitte. She's also somebody who has significant experience across not-for-profit and also personally about the way in which disability impacts, disabled people are impacted on by a workplace. And we're going to explore that right now. Dani, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Now, before we dive into some of the things that still would trouble you and certainly myself on where we're at with 2025, can you explain briefly what it is you do at Deloitte with respect to corporate culture and partner development?
Sure. So my role is Head of Partner Enablement, which basically means my job is to look after the 800 to 1,000 partners we have at Deloitte in the areas of leadership succession, development, culture, and all things sort of partner coaching as well.
Okay. And now, where does accessibility and disability fit into all of that within Deloitte first?
Yeah, great question. So as part of our values and as part of the way we work at Deloitte, we have a very large commitment to disability in all its forms. And so what we mean, disability or accessibility and inclusion in all its forms. So what we mean by that is that disability is part of a broader view that we want everybody at Deloitte to have a sense of belonging and to feel included in everything that they do at work. And that's a really important, it's a very big commitment, but it's a very important commitment. And the thing that I love about the way in which we're approaching it is it's more about creating this sense of belonging and sense of inclusion than it is about saying, well, here's a gender thing we're doing, here's a cultural thing we're doing, here's inclusion from a disability perspective. And more, how do we bring all that together, sort of intersectionality, if you like, because people with disability, people who come from different cultures, people who are Indigenous, all require similar and slightly nuanced differences in their ability to bring their best self to work. But a lot of that is not different to how you and I would want to bring our best self to work. So, wrap all that up into what is the culture that we're trying to create at Deloitte, and inclusion is a very important part of that.
Now, when you and I spoke for an audio podcast a little while before Christmas, we spoke about some of the significant issues I've encountered, growing up with disability. Mm-hmm. It troubles me that Deloitte, in its work on looking at accessibility, still finds that disabled people are not being as well accommodated in 2025 as some individuals out there might think ought to be the case. What are the problems that we're still seeing?
So we're seeing problems fundamentally in the way in which society views disability. And when you have problems fundamentally with the way in which society views disability, that then translates into organisations. Where I think Deloitte is moving in the right direction is by having real clarity of who are the people who are going to help to drive this, because you need that in any organisation. You need an inclusion, particularly from a disability perspective, to be driven by a range of people, and be careful that it's not just those with disability. Because I think then they end up, and we've seen this in many of our clients as well, they end up having two jobs. One, the job that they were employed for, and the other is increasing inclusion across the organisation. So it's really important that we raise the level of issues or opportunities that Deloitte has, certainly, much more into the senior leadership, senior roles, executive roles, such that everybody understands where the problems are and then has a commitment to do something about those. So part of the problem, I think, in organisations is the fact that typically there are a small group of people who sit in DEI who do this work, whereas actually from a cultural perspective and a true inclusion perspective, it should be everybody in the organisation that is involved in this work.
Now, you said something interesting in there that is worthwhile expanding on, and that is if you've got a person with a disability who's doing their main task, which is the job that they were employed to do, and then doing the internal disability campaign, there's a couple of problems with that. One is the disabled person then has to make up for somebody else's ignorance. An able-bodied person is the person that really needs to learn about the challenges disabled people face.
Yes.
Right. So if all you have is a person with a disability leading it, then you're still contributing to a silo mentality, are you not?
Absolutely. Which is why it's so important. And I can give you an example of one of the things that we're doing here is we're involving people with disability in broader conversations about diversity and inclusion, not just about disability. And so that then allows that person to have others who are supporting them. So we have I like to call it a lens. So you might have a cultural lens when you're looking at succession. You certainly have a gender lens when you're looking at succession. You'd definitely have an Indigenous lens and also disability. So we look at all of the different roles and opportunities for people with all of those lenses, and bringing somebody with disability who has lived experience, not just somebody like myself who has lived experience through my son, but certainly somebody who's got lived experience in the workplace, is really critical to bring in at that point. We have a particular individual who has disability who's been doing that with us for a while, and he just rings me every so often and says, hey, I've got this issue, what do we need to do about it? Which doesn't mean that it becomes a big thing. What it does is help us to educate more people about what are some of the issues that people with disability might find in an organisation like ours that we're unaware of.
To what extent are we progressing in organisations and the community where eventually we won't need to have a department that some people call, diversity, equality, and inclusion? It's interesting that we do have that department. It's interesting that we do elevate these issues to this is the box in which all these issues fall into, but it can also create an environment where some people in an organisation then point at, the box labelled DEI and say, well, that's their problem, not mine.
Yeah, look, we had a really interesting discussion about one of our clients that we're doing some work in at the moment. They're in a particular industry that is typically male dominated. And we were talking about a competitor of theirs that happened to have done a really good job of getting more women into more senior roles. And I'm using this as an example because we were, in the work that we're doing with this client, we're looking across all lenses of disability, and all lenses of diversity and all lenses of inclusion. And I was asked the question by another partner, why did it work so well in this other organisation? And I think fundamentally, we need to be thinking about what are the values of the organisation, and therefore, how does inclusion sit within those values? And how do we take, for example, a value of, say, care and broaden that out to care for everybody regardless of gender, race, disability, and make it part of the fundamental fabric of the organisation. And that, I think, is that's when it works, is how do we make it such that people don't feel disenfranchised? There are a lot of men at the moment that do feel disenfranchised by the move in gender and, the move away from inclusion in some organisations because of the people feeling disenfranchised. How do we broaden it out such that, as I said, it's one of those things that all people feel they belong? So rather than putting it into boxes, actually, as I said, make it part of the fabric of the organisation.
And that is the challenge, because if I look at my own life as a disabled person, just for some background for those who are watching who may not be aware, I was born with a rare disorder, right? And we call it hypoparathyroidism. And, it's one of those things that very few people have. So the minute you say the word hypoparathyroidism, there are people who furrow their brow, roll their eyes and wonder what the hell's going on. They don't do that with diabetes.
No.
They don't do that with a broken arm, because you can see that.
Yeah.
They generally don't do that with any sort of wheelchair-bound type issue, because they can see that. But because hypopara and a range of other disorders are also are invisible, it creates an interesting conversation when you start to try and get people to understand what that means.
Mm-hmm.
How do you encourage people to have that conversation with their colleagues in a workplace? Because on the one hand, health is a personal matter, right? And it can be challenging to have that discussion. On the other hand, if you're talking about it and enhancing somebody's understanding of the world around them, almost as if you're educating someone, an unpaid teacher or tutor, you would hope that the world would be a better place. How do you counsel people in that situation? Because it's not always easy for people to say, look, I am disabled, but I can work as well as you can. So don't focus on my disability. But yes, but your disability is interesting. How do you balance that in an organisation?
Well, if I was to turn that question around to you and say, if you were coming to work at Deloitte, what would you want to have to feel included?
Oh, this is good. I'm supposed to be interviewing, but that's all right. I can. I'm good at answering questions. If you were, if you were, and you're asking for my CV now, are you?
No.
The
I want to know what you would need to feel included or felt that you belonged.
You would, if you were in a situation where you had a rare disorder, the way in which the culture you would anticipate would exist in a professional firm would be one that says, look, I have several specialist appointments during the year that have got to come up because of the nature of what I do. To what extent does the firm enable me to be flexible so that I can do the personal stuff that I need to make sure my quality of life is as best as it can be, so that I can function at work to my optimal level.
Yep.
And that in the case of someone with an invisible condition.
Well, I mean, the reason why I asked the question is because if you think about somebody without disability, and I've got an example, one of my team members texted me over the weekend and said that somebody close to them had died. Was it okay if they went to the funeral today, they would work either side? And I said, absolutely, of course you should go and don't work either side, because it's really important that you take time. All of us have things that require us to take time out of work. Many people do pick up kids. Many people, males and females, fathers and mothers, parents, fathers and fathers, mothers and mothers, many people pick up kids. Many people need to go to doctor's appointments. We have dental appointments that are really difficult to do on the weekend. So I look at it something like what you're talking about and say, of course you're going to have medical appointments. And so let's just make sure that we've got a really good communication, such that I know when you're taking those, and that there's an enormous level of trust. So for me, so much of, and when I was running a disability organisation as CEO prior to coming to Deloitte, so much of working with people with disability and understanding their requirements at work is just asking questions and creating an environment where they're comfortable, people with disability are comfortable in being able to say, these are my requirements. I had a great example. I had a woman, a highly intelligent woman who worked for me, physically very disabled. She had muscular dystrophy. And one day she couldn't come into work because her wheelchair had broken down. And she rang me and said, I can't come into work. I can't actually get out of bed because my wheelchair's broken down. My main concern was that she had somebody coming to fix the wheelchair rather than what work she was going to get done, because she was an amazing person, an amazing employee who got through incredible amounts of work. And by just the simple fact that a mechanical failure, like somebody's car breaking down, meant that she couldn't come into work, it makes no difference whether she has disability or not. And this is the hard thing, I think, because we place so much weight on what the disability is, whether that person is going to be able to function as well, when actually the vast majority of needs that a person with disability has from a job perspective is no different to a person without disability.
Why do we have such a stigma about the whole deal? More generally, what you've said is simply common sense.
Yes.
But if we're going down the road of this discussion, which I suspect we are, we're probably both going to conclude that common sense isn't really that common. Why?
Look, my personal view, and this is not a Deloitte view at all, but my personal view is, and having had a son with also a very rare condition, partial trisomy 9p syndrome, so it's not got a catchy name.
Hold on. What's that in plain English?
So to describe it is he has, you've got 2 chromosomes in each pair. So you've got pairs of chromosomes.
Gotcha.
on one of his 9th chromosomes, he has an extra piece of genetic material. So instead of having just 2 parts of that short arm of genetic material, he's actually got 3 parts. So that makes him different. And it's so rare that you can't say, well, this is typically what happens, because there is no, this is what typically happens. And I think people also misunderstand in that if you have a genetic condition, it doesn't just mean that that genetic condition makes you who you are. You also have other genes that are your family genes. And there's also how you were brought up. And so there are so many variables that you can't be defined by what that particular genetic difference is. And I've never allowed my son to be defined by that at all. He is a really wonderful, 32-year-old young man who works on the farm, did a barista course, struggling to find a job because he has intellectual disability, but, is talking, has some physical needs, but is an amazing young man. So not defined by his disability. And I think for me, when I was talking to people as his mother, it's a bit of there, but for the grace of God go I. So I think there's such a fear around it. One day I got a phone call from a very nice older gentleman who was wanting me to give money to a charity. And I said quite clearly to this individual, I said, look, I'm really sorry. My family makes some decisions about who we give money to. I have a son with disability, and that's typically where we give money. And he said, oh, I'm terribly sorry. And I said, I don't know why you're sorry. You weren't there at the conception. So I find it extraordinary that people apologize to me about the fact that I have a son with disability. But that's the society we live in.
The interesting, let me overlay that with a personal experience of mine many, many years ago. And this will amuse some of the viewers, no doubt, and some of my former work colleagues who have been interesting images in their head. But many years ago, I was a part of a folkloric dance troupe in one of the Croatian community centres down here in Victoria. At a time when I was unemployed. So it was something to do with a way to get fit, way to hang out with people and all that sort of stuff. And one of the volunteer instructors had 2 young boys who were very curious about the things that I wear on my ear. Hypoparathyroidism, by the way, is a bit like is a disorder that has several impacts, one of which is it causes some degree of deafness.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It kind of like Windows. It's bundled with stuff. Anyway, the 2 boys were curious about the hearing aids I was wearing, because I wore, 2 hearing aids at that time. And what I ended up doing was crouching down and showing them the hearing aid, taking the buggers out and sort of showing them the batteries, etc., with the father rushing over and thinking the kids were doing something inappropriate.
Yeah.
The kids went off happy because they'd learnt something new. And I had to gently say to their father, look, don't dampen the curiosity. Because just because if you create an environment where it's perceived by them that there is something wrong because they can't ask questions, you may end up with them thinking that there is something wrong or worse, or it creates a basis for if you create a taboo, you may create something else on an ongoing basis where you don't need to.
Yes.
That was taken in good spirit. But it comes back to your earlier point. It's about communication.
Mhm.
If they don't have a fundamental basis for understanding, and we get that from communicating with others, we get that from reading, we get that from these days looking stuff up on the internet. Hopefully the right stuff, not the disinformation.
Yeah.
But that's an interesting. It's an example I've used on several occasions in conversation where if you create something, if you manufacture a taboo, you then have nowhere else to go, because you've created. If you as a disabled person can't communicate well about what you've got, you're also contributing to the lack of understanding to some degree.
Oh, absolutely. And I would extrapolate that, Tom, and say, I'm a specialist in leadership and culture in organizations. That's my professional job. And if we think about what are the fundamental important areas of leadership in an organization, one of those is curiosity and the ability to open yourself up to understand what's going on, whether it's around individual. We're doing a lot of work at the moment in complex systems thinking because of the complexity that is happening now in the world. And you take that and say, well, actually, the way in which we talk about complex systems thinking is about not being able to solve things necessarily, but potentially, coming up with solutions that are not about making things right, but are actually working in the context of the environment we are at the moment. Now, you take that and say a person with disability does that every day. And I don't think we actually harness the complex systems thinking capability in that people with disability have, having worked with many over a very long period of time, to be able to help us solve bigger problems. So not only are we hampering the simple right that everybody in Australia should have the right to work if they choose, by not employing more people with disability, we're actually hampering to a great degree organisations like ours' ability to think differently and to take on some of those ways of working that a person with disability naturally has to have because their world is complex and different.
Well, which possibly explains why I end up talking a lot about regulation. When you're born with something that has the origin may be, coming back to hypopara again, because it's what I know. The origin may be poorly functioning or completely not functioning parathyroid glands.
Mm.
But that does not mean there's only one consequence to that. There are a range of things that go wrong because parathyroid glands don't work well or don't work at all. And when you're thinking about the body as a complex system,
yes, yes,
and you're grappling with that because all of a sudden you realise that not only do you need to have a conversation with an endocrinologist, you need to have a conversation with an audiologist, you need to have a conversation with a nephrologist. In my case, because we suspect hypopara cause weaknesses around the eye muscles and facial muscles. I've got latent nystagmus, which means if I cover my left eye, my right eye decides to go off as if it's participating in a Saturday night rave. But and it's true. No, I'm not going to pull that party trick now and put some people off. But the point being, one thing can cause many others, and then you need various experts and specialists to handle all of that. And and you're right, that is where a person that is used to having to deal with things that require a GP and a, other specialists, without going into all the ists that I mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
you're then comfortable with the notion that in an audit you need tax advice, you need other advice from within a firm, because auditors are not the all-seeing, all-knowing oracles on every single subject matter under the planet. Which then leads to, obviously, another debate that we're not here to have, because we're talking about disability and how disabled people function in the workplace, as to whether accounting firms should split the audit from other expertise, etc. And that becomes a fascinating issue. Deloitte did some work recently looking at attitudes in disability. What were some of the findings, if you could recap those from the work you did prior to Christmas?
Yeah, so it relates back to what we were talking about with regards to wanting to have time for medical appointments, etc. So one of the key areas that people with disability, and this is a global study, commented on was flexibility from a hourly perspective. So flexibility in the workplace with regards to the time that they worked. And whilst that isn't necessarily a huge adjustment, a workplace adjustment, it's classified as a workplace adjustment. And that was the chief one that was not given to so many people with disability, and yet that was asked for the most. And if we go back to my example before, workplace flexibility is given to people without disability as well. And so therefore, why are we classifying it as a workplace adjustment for people with disability? It's a conversation.
It's illogical.
Yes, absolutely.
If a person without disability is able to be flexible, but you then give the same accommodation to a person with disability, why does that become a workplace adjustment? Or does the entity want to feel good that it does workplace adjustments for disabled people when somebody else gets the same?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like some workplace adjustments on, the types of screens that you might have, or a particular program you might want to have. If you look sensibly about it, people within an organization like ours, because we have consulting and audit and tax and legal and, strategy and risk. So we've got a broad range. We also have a marketing department, an HR department. All of those people will require different programs or different things for them to do their work effectively. And yet for a person with disability, we talk about it as a workplace adjustment. As I said before, all of us have workplace adjustment. All of us want to have some flexibility with work, and yet we label it for a person with disability. Fair call that sometimes there are things like a JAWS screen reader that neither you nor I would need, which of course helps people who are blind or have low vision to read a screen or to listen to the screen. But they're fewer and further between, and this global study showed that. So we're still, the other thing that showed, which, really is such a pity, I think, in organisations, is a lack of role models. So because we struggle having people with disability in our organisations, having people more senior in organisations who identify as having disability, and that's, I think, a really important one, because there would be a lot of senior people, 20% of the population basically have some form of disability. So there would be a lot of people in senior roles who have disability but choose not to disclose. And yet that is a great role model for people with disability to see that they have a place or they belong in that workplace. So that was another piece for me that I thought was, really important for us to consider. How do we create those role models in organisations? One of the things Deloitte's doing is we've now got a program with Olympians and Paralympians so that they can continue to work but have greater flexibility such that they continue to be able to do their sport. And I think that, for me, that's a really good thing for us to be doing, because it raises the lens of Paralympians and therefore disability, and does provide role models. Not that everybody wants to be a Paralympian, but does provide role models for people with disability in our organisation.
Role models is an interesting issue, but if I can take you back before we sort of wrap things up to the problem of crappy jargon and labels. How do we get rid of that garbage? Because workplace, in what you described, just because you are disabled does not mean that something should be described as a workplace adjustment because of your disability. How do we get to a point where we're actually simply just dealing with people?
That's the $50 million question, Tom. I wish.
I'll go and dig up an answer, and you give me the 50 million, and we'll be fine.
Yeah, it's got to be a good answer.
I'm known for occasionally coming up with a good one, Dani, but never mind.
Look, having been involved in the sector for 30 years, I've learned and become such a better person and such a better leader as a result of understanding and allowing myself to be curious and put myself in other people's shoes where possible. You can't do that all the time by any means.
Of course.
And the privilege of leading an organisation that predominantly employed people with disability. I can't understand why we don't. It's a way of thinking that most people just don't have. And that in Australia, we could go back, we won't now, but, you and I could talk about the history of disability in Australia. And when my son was young, a very good person sat me down over a coffee and described it to me, which actually explains a lot of what we're talking about. Because in Australia, as opposed to some of the Nordic countries that approach disability differently, we approach people with disability and put them into institutions. And so they weren't seen. And so we've still got this generation of people who've been through that, who can't get their head around the fact that people with disability have the right to live as we all do in society and should be given those opportunities. And thinking about the social model of disability as opposed to the medical model, which is what, of course, has been historically the case. So I think some of it's historical. I know my kids, respond differently to their brother who has disability than people of my age do. And I'm hoping that the generations of people that come through are starting to make that change. But to go back to where we started, I think it's a societal change that still needs to happen, that's going to have to drive some of the organisational change. And then some of the organisational change can also start to drive some of the societal change. So the two need to work in harmony.
The other $50 million question is, how do we make that happen?
That's a subject for another podcast.
And I'll pick you up on that last statement, as you probably. And Dani, the work you do is quite interesting. Where can people learn more about what Deloitte does in the leadership and culture space?
Certainly our website. That's worth having a look at. We've got a whole consulting arm that looks at culture and leadership and works in and with diversity, inclusion and equity, as it's often called now, organisations. I do some client work in that space, which I love. And I think we're leading edge in that space. So certainly going onto the website, contacting me through you would be great. And I think, the more of us that can be doing this type of work and increasing leadership and culture efficacy in organisations, the better.
Danny, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a fascinating discussion, and and I do hope that some people reflect a bit more on where they're at with how they deal with the world around them. So thanks for that.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, Tom.
My pleasure. That's the first episode of series 2 of Ravlic at Large. You can go back and see series 1, the 8 interviews I did prior to Christmas 2024, on the YouTube channel Ravlic at Large. There will be a lot more coming in the next little while, so keep your eyes peeled on on the various channels, either LinkedIn or YouTube. And I'll be with you with more shortly. But thanks for watching.